Welcome to the AirCon Vault. Here you can find recordings of the live streams from Eric's audio conference. These are made free thanks to our sponsors. A sound effect, Audio Kinetic, Boom Library, Bright Skull, Dolby, FMOD, Game Audio Learning, Game SoundCon, Kilohertz, Motion Picture Sound Editors, Rev Rooms, Sound Cuts, Sound Warriors, and Eric's, the online home for audio creatives. We hope you enjoyed the video.
Yeah. All right. Welcome everybody. This is making a TV show inside a game, the cinematic audio of Dispatch. You don't know us. My name is Ranger. I am a sound designer based out of San Diego. I started working at Ad Hoc in April of 2024, doing dialogue design for Gollum, and then I moved on to making most of the gameplay sound effects, and then I eventually rolled over to doing work on cinematics. I designed like hero and villain powers, like Mecha Man, Shroud, among other things. And Diego, tell them who you are.
Yeah, hi, I'm Diego. I'm a technical sound designer based in LA. I joined Ad Hoc in April 2025, and my contributions to Dispatch include implementing music, cinematics, and some gameplay sound effects, and building audio systems using FMOD and Unreal blueprints, and designing some gameplay sound effects too.
And yeah, disclaimer, we're not the entire audio team. We had contractors that worked with us, mostly Studio X Labs, based out of Vancouver. But we are the ones who are giving the talk today. So speaking of, what we're going to cover is sort of our general approach to audio design, and then we're going to get into how we edited and implemented a lot of the cinematic audio, and then in the back half of the talk, Diego is going to talk about a lot of our music implementation systems. So without further ado, Diego?
I was just going to say, I don't think you're screen sharing it, Ranger.
I'm not screen sharing it. Oh, you're right. Okay. That's awkward. Anyway. Now we're good, right? Okay.
Yes.
Cool. Welcome. This is us. What we're going to cover, like I said, general approach to audio design, editing implementation of cinematic audio, and then Diego is going to talk about music implementation. So let's talk high level. So if you didn't know, Dispatch was originally going to be an interactive live action TV show on a new platform called Echo that at the time had plans to host a sort of new type of interactive television. So think like Netflix Bandersnatch special, but way more seamless. But thanks to COVID, however, those plans stalled, and the studio decided to pivot to a video game format instead. But that goal of creating an evergreen piece of media stayed with leadership throughout the shift. And to rip a quote from our director's GDC talk, which if you haven't seen, I would highly recommend if you're able to, they said, if someone were to be watching you play Dispatch without the UI and without the controller, we wanted them to feel like they were watching a well-shot and well-edited TV show. And we wanted to extend this vision of uncompromising quality to the game's audio. So Dispatch needed to have the audio fidelity of a big-budget TV show while also still maintaining the reactivity of a video game, which meant that the typical sort of at-runtime approach of game audio alone wasn't going to give us the cinematic soundscape that we wanted of something like, say, like Arcane or Superman. And so if we're wondering the answer to the question, is it a TV show or is it a game? The answer is yes, it is both. We created a hybrid approach, taking advantage of conventional linear editing tools as much as possible, while also leveraging FMOD and Unreal Engine to help bridge the gaps between TV and video games that our linear tools could not. But before we dive into what that actually means in detail, it is important to briefly cover our cinematic system because our design choices were heavily influenced by this pre-established setup. The cinematics are broken up into individual chunks that we call sequences, which for the purposes of this talk, if you hear either of us say clip, sequence, sequence, we're essentially talking about the same thing. We just use those terms interchangeably internally. But what these sequences actually are in-game are Unreal sequencer clips that contain everything from media file, to audio, to visual censorship keyframes, to QuickTime events. And these sequences are played back in an unpredictable order that's shaped by the player's current and previous choices. And the animations and camera shots within these sequences are heavily planned out and edited so that they align perfectly with whatever content came before and whatever content could possibly come after, down to the frame. And this sort of very finely edited approach went beyond just carefully planning our camera shots and edits. Sometimes the transitions between clips weren't hidden by any camera cuts at all, and were instead just one continuous shot as if it were a regular TV show. If you've played the game, spoiler alert, which I probably should have mentioned at the beginning of the talk, but a great example of this kind of seamless transition is the hero cut choice in episode 3, where the shot moves to the desk and lingers over the sonar and coupe dossiers for an indeterminate amount of time while the player makes their decision before seamlessly moving to the next sequence of Robert picking up one of those folders without any cuts. So that was a lot of information and a lot of explanation. And if you ask me how we kept track of it all, my answer would be with some difficulty, but hopefully that explanation puts a lot of our creative and technical decisions that we're going to discuss in this talk into some better context. And so with that out of the way, we will begin the first chunk of this talk, cinematic design and implementation. For our cinematic content, we began by following a relatively conventional audio post-production route. We designed and edited and premixed all the cinematic audio in Pro Tools and Ableton. And the reasons for starting with this relatively normal approach rather than coming at it from the game-centric perspective were similar to the reasons why Dispatch uses pre-rendered animation. Like I mentioned during the intro, we were really trying to create a piece of evergreen content that will stand the test of time as game engines evolve and other technology advances. I do feel the need to mention here that it was just me using Ableton. I love Ableton, so I had to give it a shout out. Anyway, each episode got a linear cut and a cut that only included the choices as individual clips that we call the alts cut. And the reason that these two cuts existed was so we had a version where we could see how all the pieces fit together, because while the linear cuts did not and obviously could not possibly include every single story outcome in every single branch, they did make keeping track of the individual choices and differing story paths a lot easier, because we were able to view them as parts of a whole instead of these isolated pieces of media. And having a linear version allowed us to design and mix the audio as if it actually were a TV show, which ended up being hugely beneficial to us as we shot for that sort of big screen quality bar that we had set for ourselves. Our editors would send us these two edits via an AAF export from Premiere, and it also came with a set of markers to delineate the clip boundaries. And then similarly to how our animation worked, we edited the audio for each clip to line up with whatever content bordered it before and after. And this included things like baked-in effects like reverbs and delays, because we elected to not generate any effects for our cinematics through FMOD. And we chose this route because it allowed us to maintain absolute control over playback and take advantage of the wide breadth of audio tools and the mixing capabilities provided by our DAWs. You know, we knew once we finalized a mix in Pro Tools, that would be what was heard in game. But the system did have some downsides, one of them being occasionally there would be discrepancies between these edits and the final clips in game. And this usually occurred because a clip had to be trimmed or lengthened by a couple frames to accommodate something in the engine. But this did mean that we never quite got picture lock, so sometimes we would have to go back and tweak things, which was a bit of a tedious process. But I'll get into why that is in a bit once we've actually covered more of the implementation process in detail. Before we get into that, though, I want to briefly showcase what this editing process actually looks and sounds like. So I'm going to show you a short clip. In it, you'll see my Pro Tools timeline for the Mecha Man and Toxic Sounds in episode 1, along with those markers that I talked about to denote the clip boundaries. On the bottom right of the clip will be the video window, and in it, the sequence name is burned into the bottom. So every time you see that change, it is a new sequence in Unreal, so a new clip. You'll hear how the audio for each outcome of the QuickTime event that occurs here flows seamlessly from the QTE itself into the outcome branch, and then finally into the following sequence. And you will not see my master bus clipping because I definitely remembered to re-enable my mastering chain when I recorded this clip. So ignore that. But yes, here's the clip. So yeah, this sort of audio matching for these outcomes and branches needed to happen everywhere, for every clip, and every episode across the entire season. And it might have been hard to tell amidst some of the unfinished animation in there, but bonus points if you noticed that that combat sequence is an example of one of those continuous camera shots I talked about. Whether you fail or succeed, the transition into the outcome is seamless visually, and we had to make sure that the audio matched that level. Throughout all of that designing and editing, we spent a lot of time reviewing sounds and mixes, but we are a fully remote studio. Our audio vendor, Studio X, is based out of Vancouver, and myself and our directors are spread across Southern California, so we made do with what we had available. Our review process used a couple different softwares, absolutely none of which were meant to be used as digital dub stages, but we did it anyway. Most of my work on cinematics, like I mentioned, revolved around hero villain powers and dialogue design. So for the initial reviews of those things, we just used Slack, as much as that may make some of you here cringe. But once we started getting into the weeds of reviewing entire episodes, we switched over to a program called SyncSketch, which is shown in this screenshot. We were originally using it to review animation deliveries with the folks over at Igloo, our animation partner. But it had a really neat system of being able to leave comments on specific timestamps, along with the ability to draw in annotations on the frame. And we could also sync our sketches, so to speak, and do live reviews with everyone's playhead synced together. And these features made it useful for both, like I said, live reviews and also asynchronous reviews when we couldn't get all of us into a meeting together, which ended up happening pretty often towards the end of the project. And of course, when we could get into meetings together, we would usually just use Zoom for a few spotting and review sessions, since out of all those tools, it probably had the best audio quality. So once all of that editing and reviewing was done and our mixes were approved, we printed our dialogue, sound effects, and ambience tracks into stereo stems. And then we used those markers given to us by our editors to chop up, name, and export each file to match its food group and corresponding sequence name in Unreal. And this came out to 4,608 stems, give or take a couple, across all 8 episodes. And the reason that we opted for separated stems rather than a single stereo bounce of the full mix was so we could still give players volume sliders for the individual groups of sounds, and also have an easier time implementing things like a dialogue boost setting because we could access each bus individually. For the implementation of all of these stems, we relied on FMOD and the Unreal Sequencer timelines. Each event received its own 2D event that was routed to the appropriate bus. To keep tracking relatively straightforward, we just kept up the same naming convention, so each event was named for the food group and the sequence it belonged to. Once all that setup was done, we moved over to Unreal. And originally we were going to use the sort of usual method of just calling our FMOD events through keyframe events on the sequencer timeline with blueprints and all that jazz. But this method actually unearthed one of our first major hurdles. So our larger video buffering system for the game preloaded most of the content in a sequence before it actually played back live. But it didn't preload the stems inside of our events. Those audio assets would only get loaded once the playhead had reached the region in the sequencer timeline where an audio component was actually created and the event was called. And even if that component was created on the first frame of the sequence, there would still sometimes be an audible stutter in between clips when our stems loaded because the audio component had to come into existence first. We tried setting our stems to stream instead of load in the hopes of closing any gaps that could have been caused by loading longer stems, but Streaming them actually introduced a noticeable audiovisual desync, which was not acceptable to us and actually ended up exacerbating the stuttering problem because the audio lagged behind by a couple hundred milliseconds. And then this resulted in the tail ends of those stems getting cut off very abruptly when the sequence was unloaded after it was played. So as part of our greater efforts to maintain AV sync at runtime, one of our programmers created the beautiful ad hoc FMOD track as seen here. It's a custom sequencer track type that was adapted from our gameplay banter system, and it was set up to preload FMOD audio data when a sequence got loaded into that video buffering system by directly calling the FMOD API, and then stopping the event once the sequence was unloaded. And it allowed us to preload each stem along with the video file before the sequence actually played back, eliminating any sync issues that were being caused by trying to stream or load the entire stem during playback. B, it gave us a great visual representation of our stems in the sequencer editor as these lovely blue event blocks, which is awesome for me because I really don't understand much that is not a timeline in a DAW. And C, it actually allowed us to preview and scrub through these stems within the sequencer editor itself, instead of having to launch the plain editor to do these kinds of reviews. And this ended up being a time saver when it came to some parts of our QA. These event blocks also had a persist toggle in their context menu that allowed an event to remain loaded and continue playing across sequence boundaries, which we'll get into why that was useful in a few slides when we go over the ways that we used these sequencer timelines to help fix the problems that our DAWs could not. Here is an example of that system in action.
Wait, so the Z team, my team, their Phoenix program?
That is correct.
Your own motley crew of dangerous fuck-ups.
Very nice. So thanks to this system, our stems would play back in sync with the visual media whenever that sequence was actually played. But like I mentioned earlier when I talked about some of the drawbacks of this approach, updating our audio was not a super quick process, and by now you might be able to gather why. If we wanted to fix a single sound, it wasn't just a matter of opening up FMOD and tweaking a few dials or moving some layers around. We had to go back into the Pro Tools session, fix the damn thing, and then re-export whatever stem that sound was in, while also making sure that it still matched up with its bordering stems. And while, like I said, we did finalize and approve mixes for each episode before exporting anything through our review process, inevitably, sometimes things changed that needed to be reflected in audio. But we ended up sticking with the system because the quality bar that we had set for ourselves required a couple trade-offs in efficiency, and we think, or at least we hope, it paid off. So our goal was always the seamless playback of our audio as it appeared in our DAWs. Like I probably mentioned a couple times at this point, we really wanted to maintain absolute control. And while on paper, precisely editing all of our stems together should have been flawless using that preload system that I talked about. Like so many of the best laid plans in game development, they rarely transfer perfectly from paper to practice. So while the stems played back with no issues when assembled into our DAWs, we would inconsistently run into pops and clicks when playing things back in game using only our ad hoc FMOD tracks. And, there are a myriad reasons for this. For one thing, every device has different specs, and we just couldn't rely on absolutely superb performance across every machine. That's just not realistic. And then at the pace that we were working, there was always the chance for small export errors, especially during some of the more really complex narrative branches where there were just tons of paths to keep track of. And so this is where we get into using FMOD to bridge some of those gaps that I alluded to during the introduction. So to help mitigate those issues I talked about, we identified the problem children, some problem sounds, during both the design phase and through playtesting. We lifted these sounds from the stereo stems and we placed them into their own FMOD events, either simple one-shots, parameter-controlled sound effects, or in the case of many of our backgrounds, looping ambience beds. For a quick showcase of all of these in action, we're going to take a look at episode 2, scene 3A, where Robert meets Royd for the first time, and then we'll dive a bit deeper into the use cases for each event. The clip starts out showing a simple looping background, and also a parameter controlled event for Royd taking a piss. And then towards the end, it demonstrates the use of one of those simple one-shots as Robert uses the urinal handle.
Bruh, I almost went in my pants. Hey, you this Robert people talking about? What's up, brother? My auntie named me Roy, but people call me Roy. Oh, my bad. You think I don't touch my ding-a-ling, huh? Because we stay in the Lua.
Kinda part of the process.
No need to worry, brother. It's okay.
So, like you saw at the end of that video with the urinal handle sound effect, one-shots were very simple fire and forget events that took advantage of that persist toggle that was provided by our ad hoc FMOD tracks. When something was set to persist, the event was not unloaded along with the sequence and would instead play to its natural conclusion. We designed and edited around clip boundaries when it didn't interfere with the quality by introducing unnatural fades or weird cuts or like truncated reverb tails. And in areas where it did, we employed the use of these events. And sometimes a one-shot was actually like the entire stem. For example, if a word of dialogue was cut in half by a clip boundary, we would sometimes just export a slightly longer stem with the rest of that word included and then set the entire thing to persist to avoid any possible playback issues. And having these one-shot events allowed us to worry less about the sort of modular playback of the game and focus more on designing a smoothly flowing mix. They also help to aid transitions into and out of interactive gameplay sections. Like in the following example from episode 2, scene 5, where Robert is introducing himself to the Z team, and then at the end of the first shift in episode 5 when we transition from the shift back into the SDN break room.
Hey team, this is your dispatcher, Robert Robertson. I'm starting my first shift.
Oh my God. Tell me that's not your real fucking name. Bitch.
So very simple, but very effective. Moving on to our parameter controlled events. We used parameter controlled sound effects for long continuous sounds that persisted across more than one sequence boundary, and also for our QTE risers within the cinematics. A few of these sound effects would stutter and pop in a noticeable way when they were embedded in the stereo stem, so we opted to, save some headaches and play them back separately. Each one was handled differently because different sounds. But the general practice was to design the sound for the longest possible branch and then create smooth transition regions in FMOD that would trigger when moving from sequence to sequence using simple parameter increments. It also saved us a bit of time on the alternate branches as well because we did not have to design and implement an entirely new and perfectly timed version of that sound effect for every branch, which in some cases could have been a lot of extra work. Here are two examples. So on the left is a hand dryer sound effect that actually plays later in that bathroom scene that I showed you earlier. It has multiple loops at different perspectives. It's got start and stop sounds, and all of them are triggered when they otherwise would have played back in the Pro Tools timeline using parameters controlled on the sequencer timeline via a parameter control track that would trigger these transition regions and command instruments on cue. And the other example on the right here is our QTE sound effects. So obviously we couldn't embed these risers into the stereo stems because they were entirely dependent on player input. So we, meaning mostly Diego, rigged up this event to mix different looping layers and scatter instruments being driven by the player's progress on the QTE slider. The original intent actually was to have a few different layers that would be swapped in and out depending on the content of the scene. We were hoping to make each QTE riser like a custom sound that fit with whatever was happening on screen. But unfortunately, we did not have time to make that a reality before launch. So this event only has two variations, unfortunately. Anyway, with that subtle mention of Diego a second ago, I am now going to actually pass it over to him to round us out with the looping backgrounds.
All right, thanks, Ranger. So moving on to the looping backgrounds. As you can see, our reasons for using looping backgrounds were the same as using parameter-controlled sound effects. Since backgrounds persist between most sequences in the game, they ended up being the biggest culprit when it came to causing pops and clicks. So while we originally planned on using background stems, and that would have allowed for that absolute control of the backgrounds, it became quickly apparent that we would save a lot of time and headaches by shifting to a looping approach. These looping backgrounds gave us a clean foundation for smooth transitions between all possible branches. While the events might look a little different, these are using a similar system to the hand dryer example from before. Take this example from episode 5, where the Z-Team finds themselves at a local bar. In this scene, the perspective shifts between a few different locations. We see our heroes in the bar during karaoke, a different part of the bar during a fight, the bathroom, the bar exterior, and the taco shop exterior, where the team's talking about the events from the bar. You might notice that the bathroom doesn't have a track in this FMOD event. That's because for the bathroom, we just filtered the bar interior track using this ambience low pass parameter. Inside the Unreal sequencer, we have a reference to our audio controller blueprint, and this is where we have a few different FMOD components, including our ambience channel, which can be seen here. Right under that, you can see we have some event tracks and a parameter control track. On the green event track, we have a keyframe that triggers an event on the first frame. And this event calls a simple function that checks if the audio component is playing, and if not, we trigger it to play. We call this function in just about every sequence to make sure that the backgrounds always trigger an editor. This is primarily to prevent any potential edge cases where the player could be left with no backgrounds, and it also allows us to hear our backgrounds when playtesting an editor, even if we start on a random sequence instead of a save point. Next we have our FMOD event parameter track, which, as you might have guessed, this is where we set FMOD parameters. Sometimes we have to switch between different locations multiple times within a single sequence. This could be cutting between two characters in different locations, like Robert in the office talking to a Z-Team member out in the field, or it could be cutting from the interior of a building to the exterior. For the most part, we use simple parameter increment to swap between different loops, but like you saw with the bathroom example, we sometimes used more parameters to automate things like occlusion and volume. In a minute, we'll talk more about how we used a very similar system for music implementation, but first let's watch a video that shows our looping backgrounds in action. All right, moving on to music implementation. Our first goal for the music system was to ensure that we could maintain consistent sync to picture on all platforms. Our directors were very particular about the music timing in their edits, so we needed to ensure that the exact timing was replicated in Engine. It's pretty common to use streaming assets for music in games, but since we already know that streaming introduces latency, we went with a familiar approach for the music system and opted to use non-streaming assets. But for music, we didn't use our ad hoc FMOD tracks that Ranger mentioned earlier. Instead, we used keyframe triggers just like our looping ambience system. That meant we had to be a little more intentional about preloading events into memory, but most of the time this wasn't a real issue since music rarely gets triggered on the first frame of a sequence. This method does use more memory, but we thought it was a fair trade-off to ensure a more predictable music sync. Moving on to how we actually trigger the music. In its most basic form, we were able to get away with using one-shots. Here's what one of those events looks like in FMOD, and as you can see, there are no parameters, regions, or markers. Here in Unreal, this should all look pretty familiar since it's basically the same system that we used for the looping backgrounds. But just a quick recap, inside the sequencer we have the event trigger, and when the timeline gets to this trigger we play the music. The FMOD event just plays until the music ends, and then it's released in our audio controller. As a safety net, we did also manually release the music events using event triggers in the sequencer. But there is a lot more to the music system than that, because branching choices impact music sync. So while we got away with basic one-shots for music in some cases, more often than not, the music spanned across multiple branching choices. These choices were almost always different lengths, and in most cases, the music was composed to fit with the main branch. So we had to figure out ways to maintain sync with the alt branches. Most of our FMOD events ended up looking something more like this. This event is from the first action sequence in episode 1. You can see we have a bunch of transition regions and destination markers. We use transition regions here because we need those transitions to react dynamically and only trigger when we reach a certain frame in the sequencer. This could happen at different points on the FMOD timeline depending on what choices a player has made or even how fast they reacted to QTEs during a complex idle. And while this is a good example of how we handled a lot of the music for Dispatch, every scene presented unique challenges. So we ended up with a pretty wide variety of different approaches that had to be tailored to each scene. I want to go through a few of these scenes in more detail, and one that really stood out was the jewelry store in episode 3. The big challenge with the jewelry store is that there were multiple hacking gameplay sections throughout the scene, and the music is playing the entire time. The music here needs to flow naturally between gameplay and cinematics while maintaining that tight sync to picture. The solution was pretty simple in theory. We just have to wait for the music to reach a sync point and then let it transition back into the cinematics. But to actually make this happen was a bit trickier. Keep an eye out for this moment in the video I'm about to play. This is the moment that our director Dennis wanted the music to change intensity so it would punctuate the light bulb moment when the main character has an idea.
He's at your 7.
That wasn't so hard, was it?
He's heading your way.
This gal, I got a plan.
To make the music sync to that specific moment, we had to add a bunch of markers to the FMOD event, and they all had to have specific names. You can see we have markers that say wait for callback and do not wait for callback. These markers are used to tell the engine whether it should look out for the other markers in this event. And since this system isn't used in every situation, we had to add these because the last thing we would want is for the game to get stuck waiting for markers that don't actually exist. If we zoom in here, we can see the other markers are labeled return to story success and return to story fail. These are the callbacks that actually trigger the transition back to cinematics. And now back in our audio controller, we have the bind to Unreal event to our FMOD callbacks. And every time our music passes a timeline marker, it will trigger this custom event. We check the name of the marker, and if it has one of these specific names, it will either set a Boolean or call a dispatcher. These callbacks could really be used to trigger anything you want. This is just how we ended up using them. And then these are the blueprints where we actually trigger the return to cinematics. It's kind of like a little chain reaction where the callback triggers a dispatcher, and then the dispatcher in turn triggers one of these events in one of these blueprints. If the Boolean from the last slide was set to true, then we would wait for the callback from our audio controller to trigger the transition. But if the Boolean was false, it would just trigger the transition normally. This is really one of my favorite music subsystems to work on, actually. It was just like a really fun challenge to figure out how to make this all work. Another standout scene was the Z team at the bar in episode 5. You should remember this one from our looping background example. This scene had a lot of diegetic music, but there were so many branches that we couldn't just render the music how we wanted it to sound. Instead, we needed to dynamically control the diegetic music by automating FMOD parameters in the Unreal sequencer. Here's an example of how many parameters we could be working with. These parameters sometimes need to change multiple times in one sequence, depending on camera angles and character dialogue. And since the player has made so many choices by this point in the game, there were a lot of alt branches that needed this work done. This is what some of those parameters sound like in FMOD. Heads up, this video is a little bit loud, so.
I was going to warn them if you didn't.
As you can imagine, it was a lot of manual work to automate all of those parameters for so many different sequences. In the future, we'd definitely love to explore other ways of tweaking these kinds of parameters in a more manageable way, but this time around we just powered through and did it by hand. The example that I want to share is a system used in episodes 7 and 8. In these episodes, we had the music continue seamlessly from cinematics into the shift gameplay. But since we separated cinematic music and shift music in the audio settings, we needed to come up with a solution to keep that seamless transition while still allowing the player's audio settings to work properly. For example, if they had cinematic music turned up, but the shift music turned all the way down, we would want the music to fade out during the start of the shift. The solution we came up with was dynamically rerouting the music in FMOD. But since FMOD events can only be assigned to one bus, we had to come up with a workaround. Our solution was to assign the events to the cinematic bus and then set up a return in the mixer, which is controlled by our shift music VCA. When the shift starts, we slowly turn down the music event while we turn up a pre-fader send to the shift music return. The problem that we discovered with this approach is that FMOD sends introduce latency. And I think with the default buffer size, it's something like 25 milliseconds of latency per send. So what that meant was that during this slow crossfade, we were getting some very noticeable phase issues. To fix that, we added another send to a new return track inside the event itself. So now we had one send to a return in the mixer and one send to a return in the event. This additional return means that the signal routed to the cinematic music bus is now also delayed and perfectly in sync with the send to the shift music return. And in this picture, you can see we have these sends before a gain knob. We could have just made these pre-fader sends, but since we already had some automation on the fader, we just added a gain knob after the sends and turned it down. And here is an example of this crossfade in FMOD. Hopefully you didn't hear much of a change there, but if you were watching the mixer, you could see that the music starts in the cinematic music bus and slowly crossfades into that shift music return. And for this last example of how we played back music, I want to talk about some scenarios where our composer, Andrew, created different scores for different choices. This usually happened when there was a choice that branched off into a completely different extended scene and each branch needed unique music, or in some cases a scene might actually play different music depending on a choice made earlier in the game. One example of this was, spoiler alert, when Robert meets Phenomenon. We played different music depending on whether the player chose to kiss Blonde Blazer in the previous episode.
Actually, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. It's a little awkward to mention, but since the other night,
Blonde Blazer. Are you ready to go?
Actually, there's something I've been meaning to tell you. It's a little awkward to mention, but since the other night,
Blonde Blazer. Are you ready to go? Who is this?
I thought I'd cataloged all of your work companions.
Robert, this is my boyfriend, and I'm a man.
As you can tell, even though that was the same visuals, that music really completely changes the feel of that scene. And for this particular scene, it was a pretty simple approach. Instead of just playing our music when we hit the keyframe trigger, we first check the save subsystem to get a reference to the player's earlier choice. And then we use that choice to set a parameter before playing the event. In other cases, a player's choice will trigger entirely different scenes that will have their own unique music and impact the rest of the story. So in addition to those systems we talked about today, we also had things like profanity sensors and copyrighted music replacement, where we would play a different song in place of the licensed music. We added these settings so streamers would have options to avoid demonetization and copyright infringement. These systems were much simpler and just involved setting a global FMOD parameter from the settings menu. So we didn't think we needed to go into too much detail there. And with that, I will pass it back to Ranger to close us out.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Skipped it on you.
How dare you skip my slide? No, I think I clicked the button when you also clicked the button. I skipped your slide, actually, is what happened there. Anyway, yeah, to end us off on a funny note, here is a brief explanation and video showcase of the aforementioned profanity filter. So for both music and dialogue, the system had to be manually authored. So first we got a list of the bad words from our lovely producers, and then we went into our dialogue events and added these 1K sine tones on a separate track where the profanity occurred. And then that track was then sidechained to a limiter on the dialogue track that ducked the offending words while the bleep played to make sure that no part of the swear could be heard underneath. The sidechain was pre-fader, so for music and any distant background dialogue with the no words, we would turn the bleeps track down, but because the send was pre-fader, it would still maintain the ducking, thus still censoring those instances in a less intrusive way. This play condition, or the play condition for all those bleeps was just toggled with a global parameter linked to a checkbox in settings. And this particular system required a little bit of extra QA just to make sure that we, didn't miss any swears or anything, but it was worth it because it was very funny, which you are about to see.
Let me remind you, these calls are fucking recorded for training fucking purposes. So keep the fucking line clear before we send your stupid fucking asses back to whatever fucking cell we pulled your stupid fucking asses out of. Alright? Let me remind you, these calls are recorded for training purposes. So keep the line clear before we send your stupid asses back to whatever cell we pulled your stupid asses out of. Alright?
I think that one might actually be the funniest use of that system. Yeah, and that concludes our talk. Hopefully you got some interesting insights into our workflow, not just the hows, but also the whys of our approaches to audio design and implementation. There are definitely aspects of the system that we could have made quicker or more efficient, but we got it done, and we think, or I guess we hope, it'll still hold up in a few years, which was the goal. And it would also be an absolute crime to not mention that none of our work would have been possible without all of our very cool and epic colleagues, so many of whom we unceremoniously yoinked from their other responsibilities to randomly help us out instead. But yeah, thanks for coming, and we should have time to answer a few questions if you got any.
Thank you guys so much. That was incredibly cool, and yeah, very impressive. I have worked on some linear narrative games myself, so I have a couple of questions myself actually, but it's an interesting challenge, especially all the scene transitions and stuff, and I really enjoyed hearing about the looping ambiences, the one-shots, bridging the scenes, all of that, very creative solutions to that. And I'm going to be a bit selfish and just ask my own question first. So when it came to these different decisions, how much of that did you do in pre-production, and how much of that did you find out during production or kind of during the process and realize, oh, we have these issues, we need to iterate, we need to pivot, we need to build new things? What was that process like for you?
Probably 100%. Yeah, it was definitely one of those things where it's like we're figuring it out as we went along. The plan was like always to, you know, do like a sort of like conventional post-production route for the cinematic audio, but then like, you know, we started getting into it and we're like, okay, if we want this system to work, we have to, you know, jump through some hoops in FMOD and Unreal Engine to actually like get the stuff going. And, you know, like I said, like originally it was like, oh shit, we can't, you know, use the regular keyframe triggers because that's got its own set of problems. So yeah, it was just sort of like, you know, uncovering new issues as we sort of went through the process and polishing it up as best as we could before the game released. So
yeah, the looping backgrounds are a good example of that, where we were like fully planning on using stems for backgrounds, and then we started getting like final cuts of stuff in. We're like, okay, we need to pivot.
Yeah, to clarify with the backgrounds, like those loops are created from the stuff that we like designed and edited in Pro Tools, so they're just shorter, but it's the same stuff basically.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's
and that's why we had all those parameters too, is because we didn't want to like lose the kind of like fun nuance and detail in a lot of those backgrounds, so we'd like trigger those changes as much as we could with parameters.
Gotcha. So basically you designed these things first, then you realized, right, we can't take this over just as stems, so we need to create these and then re-engineer it within FMOD and Unreal using the parameters to manipulate those ambiences in order to transition smoothly between all these theme changes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, that's a interesting challenge. Also, like, yeah, this is game dev, right? You think you've got to figure out, and then you go into these problems, and yeah, big tricky thing. We had another question, which is, were you guys bouncing really long stems out of Pro Tools, and what was your export method?
So no, we weren't bouncing really long stems out. We had print tracks, and we would, you know, print our mix through those, and then like those edit markers that we got were, we would chop up all these files from those prints that we did, and then we would just bounce them out as individual little chunks. I think on like one of the slides I had a picture of one of our delivery folders, and it's just like a long list of sequence name and numbers with, you know, the individual food group appended at the end, and all of those are like an individual chunk of that big print that we made. But yeah, hopefully that answers that question.
Yeah, I think our longest stem was probably like a minute or two.
Yeah.
But sometimes they were very short, and then we had
very
like one like
dependent.
We had like one long export just in case we needed to like make any fixes after, but we didn't use it much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. And then I have another question, which is, so when I worked on the linear narrative games, on both ones, the biggest issue was that the picture was constantly changing. So they were always resyncing stuff. Well, they were changing the animations, or the editing, the files, whatnot. And so whenever we went into the game, played it, we realized all of this stuff is out of sync. How did you keep track of all of that, especially with all the different branching narratives? What was the process behind that, of staying on top of things and tracking that and making sure that everything is, the audio represents the visuals correctly?
Absolute like insane shout out to production. They made sure that our partner always had like the latest edit that we could possibly give them. And for the most part, it wasn't so much any of the animation changing. It was usually just like, oh, you know, we gotta like cut this clip by like 10 frames because it just, you know, something's up with it. And then we would have that information relayed back to us, or we would get a new, you know, AAF that we would then re-import and update our sessions with. And then usually that just involved sort of like moving stuff in the session. It wasn't like a huge, like, oh God, we got to go back and like redo this whole thing. It was just like a bunch of little things that we had to keep track of.
That's impressive. Yeah, that speaks volumes about how well the rest of the production is, I would say.
Yeah.
Because
like we audio development sort of started later. I wasn't even hired until 2024, but they had done some work before I got there, and so they had a pretty robust pipeline, like production pipeline, with the animation people. So like because that system was like already in place and they had, some time to wrap their heads around that. Definitely, I think made helping us stay on top of that kind of stuff not necessarily easier, but less confusing.
Yeah, and we are like still a pretty small studio, so like everyone on the team is doing work on the game, and we're all kind of like sharing, like, oh, we found this thing. We've like someone's sharing, like, hey, the audio's a little weird in this spot, and so it's kind of like a whole collective approach where everyone was helping everyone, and we had QA checking stuff, but definitely shout out to production and all our teammates.
Great. Yeah, that's great. I mean, makes me happy to hear that. Because, yeah, I've had some various experiences with that.
I do not envy them their jobs.
Yeah. Then another question, which is, did you use destructive record so you didn't have to point to a new asset when making changes in Pro Tools, or did you print new audio assets with each change?
The re-export process, at least, so I did work on the cinematics, but I only really edited and mixed the like finale action scene for episode 8. So like that big, like sort of like 20-30 minute chunk. And at least as far as my workflow goes, I just had sequence markers and I just reprinted over the sequence marker. And then I would, consolidate it with the rest of the clip that was not messed up or wrong or something, and then I would re-export that. But yeah, I did not use destructive record much. That option gives me anxiety.
Yeah, that's anything destructive is like.
Yeah, I'm always like, oh god, what if I screwed up the fix and I have to go back? Like, oh no.
Yeah. And then you hope for like the autosave versions.
Yeah, I have so many backups, so many autosaves. I'm like a chronic autosaver. I've been burned enough.
Yeah. Last question is, for the jewelry store music and all of like those FMOD markers that you showed off, those whole intricate ones, was that more of an iterative process? Kind of, did you find that out later? And yeah, basically, what was the process behind that?
Yeah, that was like our director Dennis had done. I think he's the one who did like the linear edit with the music. I think Ranger, you might have helped edit that music too.
I initially implemented it, but like I am not a technical sound designer, like, just to make that clear. That is why I have Diego. So I couldn't get it to hit exactly when it was supposed to hit. And then Diego came along and fixed it, but I'll let you explain a little bit.
Yeah, so we knew there was like these certain points in the cinematics, like the one in the example that we really wanted to hit, and we just didn't know quite how to transition out of the gameplay to make sure those actually synced up, without, to actually keep the music in time, without just having like a weird crossfade in the music or something. So that was just a system that I ended up going pretty deep on and just like trying stuff, and it ended up being a lot of manual work, just finding those sync points and just like testing and testing over and over again. But yeah, once we figured it out, it was like, okay, I think at most it was like an extra half second added on to the end, like when it says hacking complete, and whether it's a success or fail, it adds at most like a half second to that before transitioning back to the cinematic, just based on the tempo of the music.
Yeah.
So it just ended up working pretty good.
Yeah, I think our general approach for like a lot of the music stuff was like, okay, we have this emotional beat that we really gotta hit. Let's work backwards from there and sort of find out the places where the timing could get screwed up, and then work backwards trying to fix those so like everything lines up with that one specific emotional beat.
Yeah, exactly.
Nice. There's actually another chat question that just came through, again, related to the music. What was the biggest challenge of this project, music implementation wise?
I mean, I think some of those examples were pretty pretty big challenges. Some scenes seemed like really innocuous and like, oh, like that's no problem, but they ended up being big challenges. Like another one that I didn't end up talking about was the alley scene in episode 1, where like Blonde Blazer and Robert are just talking in the alley and then they fly away. We wanted the flight music to hit a certain beat, but it just like was not working with all the different branches. So I actually had to get our composer Andrew to send me like long held out fermatas of each chord in that alley scene, and then I like made these transitions where like they ended up working pretty smoothly. So there's just like little things like that popped up all over the place. But it all, honestly, I thought there was going to be like a lot more challenges and like spots where we just like wouldn't be able to make it work, and it went surprisingly smooth.
Yeah, not exactly like a challenge, but I had a lot of fun doing this. At the end of episode 4, the music goes from like it being a like diegetic trailer to like just, you know, non-diegetic music into the credits, and I had to basically like write like in my head this like trailer edit of both the streamer and you know, licensed track, and turn them into a trailer and then put it into the room and then like transition it out into the non-diegetic music. And it was like, I don't make trailers, so like that was fun and also very interesting to try and figure out how to, you know, make that sound like an actual trailer.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
it was very fun.
That's a good example too, where it's like, yeah, we have these sections like the bar fight in episode 5 where we had this like whole diegetic parameter controlled music system to make it work, but then we have scenes where like that episode where there was few enough branches that Ranger was able to just make that edit, and we were able to just make the transitions easily in without needing to like do this whole thing with parameters. So it really was just like figure it out per scene and make it work.
Awesome. All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for the fantastic talk. Really, really enjoyed that. And yeah, we've got one more coming up, which is about sound design cow tools. It's back on Airwiggles, so make sure to catch that. And again, a huge thank you to you for the great presentation. And yeah, we will see you all again on Airwiggles shortly.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Thanks.